My name is Timothy Green. I am the Canada Research Chair for Shellfish Health and Genomics at Vancouver Island University. I have a research program really looking at how shellfish are going to adapt to what I refer to as ocean change. So we know our oceans are changing. There's obviously climate change where the seawater temperature is raising in temperature. There's lots of CO2 addition, but there's lots of other things, as we have globalization, we're moving lots of vessels around, which brings diseases to new locations. And we have changing diets. And so there's intensification of aquaculture. It's a really interesting area of research.
Well, I'm super excited to talk to you today. When we were looking at resources, it felt like there are so many different versions of what an oyster farm could look like. If you could paint a picture of what it looks like.
So, shellfish farming is incredibly varied depending on the kind of product and the kind of farming that historically took place in that location. So you might have sort of more extensive shellfish farming where farmers go out and they catch wild caught seed, a place where we know there's going to be a lot of settlement and collecting the spat, putting them down on a mud flat and just allowing them to grow. We can then go all the way to the other extreme where we have shellfish that are produced in a hatchery environment. So, the farmers will spawn the oysters, they will grow the larvae, they will settle them in the tank, and then they will take them out to a farm where they're kept in cages. They often might rumble and tumble them in those cages, and that changes how the shell grows. And so you might go from a very flat kind of oyster to a very deep cupped oyster. And in some markets, that's considered a lot more valuable than maybe a flat oyster. So think about, pouring a little bit of sauce over the top of an oyster. If that oyster is very flat, it's going to run off, whereas a deep cup oyster looks nice and plump. Chefs can do a little bit more work with it. So yeah, it really comes down to the farmer's preference.
So you're just mentioning different types of oysters. How much do oyster species vary? Like if we take the Pacific oyster versus the Eastern oyster?
So between an Eastern oyster and a Pacific oyster, to the general person, they're pretty much similar. I'm a shellfish biologist and I can list off a whole list of weird and wonderful things about the difference between the two species. The Pacific oyster is grown in most places around the world. It originates out of Japan, and it was chosen because in the past it was considered really disease resistant and very fast growing. So the Eastern oyster, it struggles with a number of different diseases, parasite diseases, which the Pacific oyster doesn't. That, I would say, is really the big difference. They still are cupped oysters. They still provide the same ecological services. The temperature and salinity regimes that they like to grow in is slightly different, but yeah, they're pretty similar.
So I understand that oysters filter water, and this is a key ecosystem service. What are the actual mechanisms, or what's going on inside the oyster when they filter water?
You can actually shuck an oyster and look at this process by putting a little bit of dye in the water, and you can see that the oyster has gills like a fish that it uses for respiration. And along those gills is little cilia that beat along, that create a water current to push the water across the gill so it can breathe. The gill also has the second function, which is where it filters the water. So all those little cilia, they, like a little fine mesh, they're grabbing particles of phytoplankton and other things that the oyster wants to eat out of the water column, binds it up in a little bit of mucus, and then the cilia slowly beat and move those food particles down to its mouth. Shellfish are amazing that they have this tissue type called the labial palp. It sort of sorts out the good particles from the bad particles. It consumes what it wants to eat, and then bits of junk and debris that have low nutritional value, it binds up in mucus and then spits outside of the shell. So they're really quite amazing of how they take particles out of the water column and then sort them to how they want to eat them and then dispose of the waste. By filtering the water column, you're removing all the particles, the mud, out of the water column, and now light can penetrate to the bottom. And that's when you suddenly start to get your eelgrasses, your seagrasses starting to grow. Then come the natural little fish and things like that live in that habitat, and so on goes the system. Mm-hmm. And you can clearly see that in places where there are farms, and certainly, you know, the oysters are off the bottom. So, you know, the farmers aren't really disturbing the bottom when they come and harvest. You can really see very, very lush seagrass meadows sitting underneath those farms because the light's penetrating through, and then all the other benefits that come. Lots of other organisms love to live on shellfish. You know, they'll lay their eggs on shellfish, little fish and things like that. You know, I always feel that I grow 1 kilo of shellfish and I get about 40 kilos of other mussels and seaweed and things like that that live and filter and clean the water.
How long does something like that take?
So it's not my area of expertise, but it happens pretty rapidly. Yeah, they really are constantly filtering the water and moving those particles. You know, if you fill up a tank of water and put a lot of phytoplankton, within, you know, half an hour, you'll see that water is now clear.
Wow. Felt like in my research, oysters kept popping up. Like that was where I saw the most amount of research and conversations around oysters. Are other shellfish, do they help filter water? Is there a reason oysters are more focused on?
So all shellfish are going to have great ecosystem services. And if you think about a mussel reef, it does exactly the same. It's just in the aquaculture context, and certainly for a lot of the bays on the east coast of the US, you know, they have large oyster populations, combined with that there's quite a large industry of aquaculture. And so I guess that's the focus. But there's, you know, mussels, scallops, other bivalves that filter feed, they all provide a lot of service to us.
And you just mentioned, I didn't realize that a mussel reef could exist. I've heard a lot about oyster reefs. Can all shellfish create reefs?
So, you know, some won't create a reef, but, you know, rocky shores that have high wave impact, you might have large mussel reefs build on those. They're not the kind of environment where an oyster likes to live. That's where a mussel exploits it. And so, you know, you might have inside a bay, it'll be predominantly clams and oysters. And then on the outside of the bay, exposed to the rougher ocean, will be where mussels tend to congregate.
Okay. And so they might, you mentioned, so clams and oysters might mix, but mussels don't. And that's just because they prefer different environments.
There are certain mussels that will be in a bay, and, you know, they may be on ropes, but they tend not to like soft sediment. So that's where, you know, our oysters and certainly our clams tend to live. And then, you know, sandier bottoms might be where you tend to find, you know, like a school of scallops that swim around and occupy that niche.
I know you have a variety of applied research projects going on. Could you talk a little bit about what you're researching and what you've been finding?
Yep. So, you know, we know that climate change is coming. It's going to have impacts on our shellfish. So things like when we burn fossil fuels, we put CO2 into the atmosphere, the ocean's absorbing a large amount of that CO2. And when water and CO2 mix, it creates carbonic acid, and that is what we refer to as ocean acidification. That's an issue for shellfish because they can't form the little shells because it's getting dissolved away. Lots of research have looked at that and shown that that's an impact. On the flip side, you know, we know that elevating temperatures, in particular marine heat waves, so it's not the fact that we're slowly increasing the temperature, it's how the frequency and the variability that's occurring in the temperature, that causes issues and is causing large amounts of mortality. And then we have diseases as well that are getting introduced. Previous scientists have looked at each of those stresses individually. What my program's really trying to do is to understand, if we breed an oyster that's resistant to ocean acidification, is it also going to fare well to temperature and disease? Or are we going to have an oyster that can do well in one that will succumb to the next stress? I can happily say that, you know, what we're finding is that a fast-growing larvae oyster is faster growing as an adult. They also happen to be more resistant to ocean acidification. And because they can tolerate that ocean acidification, they're actually less stressed when they are impacted with a disease. And so luckily, all those things that are going on are correlated to make a decent oyster for the future.
How long does this take to
it'll be the rest of my career. But you know, we can do it in about 1 to 2 years. So an oyster's life cycle takes about 2 years for it to grow to sexual maturity. And then we can assess each of the families for each of the traits. So are they resistant to ocean acidification? Do they grow quickly? Do they have a nice shell shape for market? Are they disease resistant? And then we try to slowly select the best individuals. We can cross an ocean acidification resistant animal with a disease resistant animal, and hopefully we end up moving the population forward. So every year we will get slightly better oysters.
How much does taste play a role in it? Like, is there a big difference in taste, or is it more about, like you're mentioning, like the appearance of the shell?
I think it will come in the future. At present, most farmers are really just interested in keeping an oyster alive. So where we are on the Pacific Northwest, we have two big stresses. We have ocean acidification. Our seawater pH is dropping faster than most other places on the planet. And the marine heat waves, is a bigger effect. We're increasing 4 times faster in this part of the planet than other areas for temperature. So you've got these double whammy, and that's really, I feel, resulting in why we have such high shellfish mortality. So 4 out of every 5 oysters the farmers put out on their farm are dying in the Pacific Northwest at present.
Do you know why the effects there are seemingly more intense in the Pacific?
I think there's a lot of people, oceanographers, trying to understand things like the blob. Winter storms seem to be moving further north, and so our oceans aren't cooling as quickly in winter, and so we come into summer slightly warmer, combined with less cooling of wind patterns, and then the alkalinity of our seawater is a little bit lower than other places. And so when you push CO2 into the water, create carbonic acid, there isn't the buffering capacity that you have in other places. And so, if we absorb the same amount of CO2, the pH will go down quicker in the Pacific Northwest than maybe other parts of the world.
Is this impacting other species, other shellfish in the same way?
It must be, yeah. So all shellfish as larvae create an aragonite shell, and so it must have the same impacts.
Okay.
And so
your research is focusing on oysters.
We focus on oysters and scallops, both of them because the industry is reliant on them.
Is there anything interesting in particular about scallops in your research with scallops?
So scallops, we're trying to do the same sort of program. There's a lot to learn about how do you actually breed a scallop successfully in a hatchery. And we're largely doing it because we want to help First Nation communities that are often in remote areas. They see shellfish farming as a sustainable practice. They have a long culture of shellfish farming. Their sea guns, clam guns, where they've tended crops. So it fits really well. The problem with clams and oysters is that, when you're in a remote community and you've got a live product that you have to ship, the shipping costs become too high. Whereas scallops, it's really just the abductor mussel that we eat in North America. And we're happy that, it's the same value, whether it's frozen or fresh. And so there they have an advantage of being able to do scallops in these more remote communities.
Obviously, I would always buy oysters in the shell. Scallops I've really never seen in the shell. Is there a reason?
It's just a North American sort of culture. Whole fresh scallop is delightful. In lots of other parts of the world, we'll eat the gonad or they'll eat the whole animal. I think it comes back to the fact that we have some phytoplankton toxins that get bioaccumulated in scallops. And so if you eat the abductor mussel, it's safer than eating other parts of the scallop. Now we have a lot of food safety and testing. We know those other parts of the scallop are safe. However, tradition just means we eat the abductor mussel. There's a lot we can do with scallops, and it's educating the public to eat more of the animal.
Sometimes hearing it can be really overwhelming to think about these impacts that we're having. So what are things that we can do, or what roles can we play in these issues?
We've just been talking about shellfish. It's one of the least CO2 emitting forms of animal protein that we can eat. So, cut down on your red meat. I love eating my steak. But the question is do I need to have a steak that's the size of my dinner plate? Or can I eat, 150 grams once a month and really enjoy it? And then look at other low carbon forms of protein, such as chicken. It's good. Shellfish is even better. So, we eat a lot of shellfish at our dinner table.
How did you get into this work? Can you tell us a little bit about your background and story?
As a teenager, I was doing work experience, as most kids go off and spend a week getting some work experience during high school. I happened to do mine on an oyster farm. I love fishing. I love the marine environment. Oyster farming was quite common where I grew up. And so I decided I wanted to be an oyster farmer. My parents said, no, you're off to university. And that's where I discovered you could actually go to university and study oyster farming, aquaculture. And I've never looked back. So I've had the opportunity to travel the world. I've lived in France, the US, the UK, and now Canada. So it's been a really fun career.
Well, thank you so much for your time. This is really interesting and we really appreciate it.
Yep. Well, thank you.